This is Better Than News, and I'm Joe Darginio with your weekly White House report for February 25th to March 3rd, 2023. What are they up to this week? Well, they're issuing lots of proclamations. We'll actually take a look at one of those. They're issuing waivers regarding supply chains and government influence on supply chains. Keep in mind, supply chains is industry, is big business. It's a lot of money. We're continuing the national emergencies in Zimbabwe, Ukraine, and Venezuela. And of course, we're sending more money to Ukraine. Take a look.
February 27, 2023, we have a memorandum on presidential waiver of statutory requirements pursuant to the Defense Production Act of 1950, amended on Department of Defense supply chain resilience. So what we have here is another waiver. Authority vested in me is the President by the Constitution and the laws, including the Defense Production Act of 1950. So we'll be taking a look at that. This section gives him the authority to issue a waiver to ignore this section A1 through A6 as it applies to supply chains enumerated in these two reports: building resilient supply chains, revitalizing American manufacturing, and fostering broad-based growth, 100 days reviews under Executive Order 14017. So we'll take a quick look at that too. And this also defense report entitled Securing Defense Critical Supply Chains, an action plan developed in response to President Biden's Executive Order 14017. So specifically for defense, organic industrial based supply chains critical to the Department of Defense, and critical supply chains for electronics, kinetic capabilities, which is brute force weaponry, castings and forgings, minerals and materials, and power and energy storage. That will come up later. Energy storage, we know lithium is huge for that industry. And ensuring a robust, resilient, and sustainable domestic industrial base is essential to our national security and the preservation of domestic critical infrastructure. Those are things that generally we should be concerned with. And the law that we're going to look at here is being waived. Let's take a look at Chapter 55, Defense Production. So the part that's being waived is here, A1 through 6. So in general, to create, maintain, protect, expand, or restore domestic industrial-based capabilities essential for national defense, the President may make provision for purchases or commitments to purchase an industrial resource or critical technology item for government use or resale, the encouragement of exploration, development, and mining of critical and strategic materials and other materials for the development of production capabilities, and for increased use of emerging technologies in security programs and rapid transition of emerging technologies from government-sponsored research and development to commercial applications, and from commercial research and development to national defense applications. Okay, all that sounds good, like it's going to help us make America all it can be. And this establishes pricing, which we want to be in line with the market price of whatever the items are. Delivery dates limit more than a year after the date of termination of this section. Here in section 5, it says, except as provided in 7, which is the waiver, the President may not execute a contract under this subsection unless the President, on a non-deligible basis, determines with appropriate explanation, material, and in writing that the industrial resource, material, or critical technology is essential to national defense, and without presidential action under this section, the United States industry cannot reasonably be expected to provide the capability for the needed industrial resource, material, or critical technology item in a timely manner, and purchase commitments, or other action pursuant to this section are the most cost-effective, expedient, and practical alternative method for meeting the need. So this is one of the things that's being waived. So we don't have to determine with appropriate explanatory material and in writing why we need this and why we should go about taking action. Also being waived are written notice to the committee if such actions exceed $50 million, and further reporting if it is to exceed $50 million. Now, the requirements in paragraphs 1 through 6 may be waived, which is what the president is doing with this action. And it's written into the law that you can ignore the law. And so all these restrictions don't have to be adhered to. So the material that this applies to comes from these two reports. So we'll take a look at those two reports real quick. This is the first report listed that is going to identify industries that are getting the waiver to the Defense Production Act restrictions. So here on page 8, we find critical supply chains identified, and those are going to be the semiconductor manufacturing and advanced packaging, large capacity batteries, critical minerals and materials, and pharmaceuticals and active pharmaceutical ingredients. Now this report is very interesting to read. If you search for dollar signs, you end up finding quite a bit of opportunities and government expenses, government commitments. We recommend this Congress back this program with $50 billion in funding is one statement here. This is a lot of information to process. This is a 250-page report. And just skipping through, two semiconductor industry sectors contributed through $35 billion to the U.S. economy in 2019. Another interesting note there, but yeah, follow the money. Always follow the money. There's lots of information on China in this report. Chinese government is devoting $100 billion in subsidies to its semiconductor industry. That's very interesting. By the way, a dollar sign appears 282 times in this 250-page report that includes the cover pages. But yeah, here's a life hack. Get this report and just search through where the dollar signs are, because I'm sure you will find opportunities in the hundreds of billions. And don't you know the people writing this report know about those types of opportunities? And the second report mentioned is this one, an action plan developed. So this talks about kinetic capabilities, current missile systems, energy storage and batteries, high capacity batteries with particular focus on lithium batteries. And we're going to take a look at something interesting in regards to that. Microelectronics appears to be the range of industries that are included in here. So again, the president is waiving all those wise and noble guidelines for government influence on supply chains, for electronics, kinetic capabilities, castings and forgings, minerals and materials, and power and energy storage. So they mentioned they're particularly interested in lithium. So where does it come from? According to this article that I found, apparently Chile in South America is the largest reserve and production in the world market, and Australia is second. And I find that interesting because very recently the United States announced that it was selling 9 nuclear submarines to Australia. Apparently there's a concern that Australia might be in trouble with China somehow. Part of a defense partnership aimed at countering China's growing military power, it says, according to this report by NPR on March 13th. Now, we're protecting Australia, and they've long been an ally, but some of us know that Australia recently has had major reforms in their gun laws, and now a person must have a firearm license to possess or use a firearm, and license holders must demonstrate a genuine reason for holding a firearm license, and they do not allow them to claim self-defense as a genuine reason. I also would assume defending oneself from tyranny is not a genuine reason, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And it's interesting that Australia is using law enforcement to enforce medical lockdowns involving COVID, and even arrested a woman for a Facebook post that, according to USA Today, falsely claimed that the coronavirus pandemic was the biggest hoax on earth. That woman was arrested. There's a video. I've seen it. You should watch it. Cops coming to arrest her for a Facebook post criticizing the lockdowns. So I'm a little concerned for my friends in Australia, but I'm glad that they're going to have 9 nuclear subs to protect them from China. On February 28th, 2023, there were 4 proclamations, and I generally don't pay much attention to that because these proclamations are largely just words on topics that have absolutely nothing to do with all of the money that these politicians are throwing around. So here on March 1st, we have the presidential determination pursuant to the Defense Production Act, which we just talked about, as amended on air-breathing engines, advanced avionic position navigation and guidance systems, and constituent materials for hypersonic systems. So that's a whole lot of the same thing we just talked about, but in regard to these hypersonic systems, guidance systems, navigation, which is basically here hypersonic warfighting mission. It's military grade materials and components, and he's issuing the same set of waivers. Here we are. I waive the requirements of Section 303, A1 through A6 of the Act for purposes of expanding domestic production capability for air-breathing engines, advanced avionics position and navigation, and guidance systems, and constituent materials for hypersonic systems. Another waiver, another politician doing whatever he wants. Also on March 1st, we have a continuation of the national emergency with respect to Zimbabwe. I don't hear a lot of people talking too much about Zimbabwe, but there is a standing executive order It's Executive Order 13288. And as you've seen in previous videos, this is a lot of may not transmit goods or currency with the people involved. The government of Zimbabwe has systematically undermined the nation's democratic institutions, employing violence, intimidation, and repressive means, including legislation to stifle opposition to its rule. The campaign to ensure the continued rule of Robert Mugabe and his associates was clearly revealed in the badly flawed presidential elections held in March of 2002. And of course, there are the accompanying accusations. So this notice of continuation on the national emergency with respect to Zimbabwe, of course, starts off citing Executive Order 13288 and Executive Order 13391 and Executive Order 13469. And it goes on to say, the actions and policies of certain members of the government of Zimbabwe and other persons to undermine Zimbabwe's democratic processes or institutions continue to pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the foreign policy of the United States. For this reason, national emergency declared must continue, and continuing for 1 year, the national emergency declared in Executive Order 13288. Well, what is Executive Order 13288? And of course, this is George W. Bush invoking the International Emergency Economic Powers Act and declaring a national emergency, which of course gives him special powers, and talking about the campaign to ensure the continued rule of Robert Mugabe and his associates was clearly revealed in a badly flawed presidential election held in March of 2002. And here, all property and interests in property of the following persons that are in the United States or come within the United States are blocked and may not be transferred, paid, exported, withdrawn, or otherwise dealt in. The persons listed in the annex to this order, any person determined by the Secretary of the Treasury. And of course, we're giving the Secretary of the Treasury a little more power. And here we are again with the Secretary of Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State, and to employ all powers granted to me by the IEEPA. We talked about that, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. So what's going on in Zimbabwe that gives this a special focus by our Secretary of Treasury and Secretary of State? So this looks like presidential elections were held in 2002 and were fraught with allegations of vote rigging, intimidation, and fraud. That was just before these executive orders started. The most interesting element of this is their economy. And main foreign exports of Zimbabwe are minerals, gold, and agriculture. Largest trading partner of South Africa on the continent. Zimbabwe's exports, looks like gold is over 40% of their exports in 2019. So that's pretty big to have that much gold coming out of your country. Also on March 1st, we get a continuation of the national emergency with respect to Ukraine. And I think we know what a lot of this is about. And this dates back to executive orders declaring a national emergency as far back as March 6th of 2014. It was Executive Order 13660, which I believe we've talked about. Executive Order 13661. Executive Order 13662. Executive Order 13685 in December of 2014. September 20th, 2018, I believe that would be under Trump's presidency, Executive Order 13849 to take additional steps to implement certain statutory sanctions with respect to the Russian Federation. Let's take a closer look at that. Executive Order 13849, and this is through the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, of course, the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which we haven't talked about yet, the Ukraine Freedom Support Act of 2014, and a few other sections of our U.S. Code. And this is different. When the President or Secretary of State or Secretary of the Treasury, which we haven't talked about those under Trump yet, delegated to the President, by the President in accordance with the terms any of the sanctions set forth below to impose on that person prohibit any United States financial institutions making loans or providing credits to the sanctioned persons totaling more than $10 million in any 12-month period. Prohibit any transactions in foreign exchange that are subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. Prohibit any transfers of credits or payments between financial institutions. And of course a variety of other making of contributions or provision of funds, goods, or services. We've heard that line before. The Export-Import Bank shall deny approval of the issuance of any guarantee, insurance, extension of credit. March 1st, 2023, the President issued a notice on the continuation of the national emergency with respect to Ukraine, and of course the associated message to Congress. So this apparently began back in 2014 with Executive Order 13660. It was expanded by Executive Order 13661 and again by 13662. And they're all the same sorts of things we've seen, imposing travel restrictions and sanctions against financial transactions, material transactions, and it goes on. And of course, Donald Trump issued Executive Order 13849 with respect to the Russian Federation, which addressed Crimea in Ukraine and Russian aggression there. And of course we conclude with, I am continuing for 1 year the national emergency. And again, national emergency means they can spend a lot of extra money. So let's take a quick look. Executive Order 13660 is here on March 6th. And of course this is actions or policies that undermine democratic processes or institutions in Ukraine, security, peace, stability, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, misappropriation of state assets of Ukraine or an economically significant entity in Ukraine, asserted governmental authority over any part of the region, any part or region of Ukraine without authorization of the government of Ukraine, and material assisted, sponsored, or provided financial, material, or technological support, or to be owned, controlled by, or have acted or purported to act for or on behalf of, directly or indirectly, any person whose property or interest in property are blocked pursuant to this order. So it's a similar sort of language we've seen in many others when it comes to sanctions. So Executive Order 13661, Executive Order 13661, of course, talks about the Russian Federation and those associated with that. Executive Order 13662. Ukraine, Russia related sanctions, of course. Executive Order 13685 deals with the Crimea region of Ukraine. Executive Order 13849. And this was just a year ago. New investment in these regions of Ukraine. That would be the Donetsk People's Republic or Luhansk People's Republic. And Executive Order 14065. And this is efforts to undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. So again, this is more of the same. Just wanted to go over it real quick and highlight the executive orders and show you that they are all in line with what we have seen before when it comes to sanctions and travel restrictions and otherwise giving it to whoever that may be. Now, one of the things that was mentioned in here, actually it was mentioned in a few of them, but this is Proclamation 8693, and this is very much a consolidation. Let's see, suspension of entry of aliens subject to United Nations Security Council travel bans and International Emergency Economic Powers Act sanctions. So basically, anybody that shows up on any of those two lists, well, let's take a look at this. This is Proclamation 8693, signed by President Barack Obama, and this is kind of a consolidation saying, look, all of these people that are on all of these lists are limited in their movement and their interactions, and so they provide a fairly comprehensive list of everybody that applies to. On this list we see Liberia. I don't speak French, but if that were English, I would pronounce it Côte d'Ivoire. Let's see, Sudan, Lebanon, North Korea, Somalia, Congo, Eritrea, Iran, Libya, Afghanistan, and Al-Qaeda. And on our own personal little sanctions list, let's see, terrorists who threaten to disrupt the Middle East peace process, significant narcotics traffickers, Sudan, Western Balkans, Yugoslavia, persons who threaten to commit or support terrorism, Taliban, Zimbabwe, Burma, we talked about Burma, let's see, Iraqi regime, Iraq and modification, let's see, Syria, Liberia, weapons of mass destruction proliferators and their supporters. Well, we should really take a good look at that one. And then again, this French name that I can't feel like I can accurately pronounce. And it goes on: Syria, Sudan, Belarus, Sudan, Congo, Iraq, Lebanon, Burma, Syria, Burma, Zimbabwe, Somalia, North Korea, Libya, Syria, and, oh look, transnational criminal organizations. We'll get back to that one. And also on March 1st, I guess it was Sanctions Day, Venezuela, apparently Executive Order 13692. And so I'm pulling Executive Order 13692 from home.treasury.gov, and I'm trying to share all of this with you so you can find it yourself. And of course, current or former official of government of Venezuela is the target here in a nutshell of course, the same range of sanctions and travel restrictions. And of course, in all of these, Secretary of Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State. So, once again, those two have quite a bit of say in who gets prosecuted and restricted according to these sanctions. Um, And we notice some of the accusations are listed here in this executive order. Erosion of human rights guarantees, persecution of political opponents, curtailment of press freedoms, use of violence and human rights violations, and abuses in response to anti-government protests and arbitrary arrest and detention of anti-government protesters, as well as the exacerbating presence of significant government corruption. Well, I'm sure Venezuela is not the only place that's going on. So we go on and see that the president took additional steps pursuant to this in 2017. So that would have been Donald Trump. And 2018, 2018, 2018. And even though we know pretty much what all this says, sanctions, material goods and services, travel, let's just take a look here, just in case anything jumps out at us. Term government of Venezuela, including Central Bank of Venezuela and Petróleos de Venezuela. Now, of course, hopefully we all know what a major product of Venezuela is, and that is, of course, petroleum. There was a time recently that petroleum, gasoline, refined gasoline, was actually cheaper than water. And I don't even need to look that up. If you question that, feel free to look it up yourself. But I believe they were paying about 25 cents a gallon for gasoline there at one point recently. Now that may have changed since I last heard that. And the last thing that I want to address in this weekly White House report is a proclamation on National Consumer Protection Week 2023. And families deserve to be protected from fraudsters and scammers who often prey on the most vulnerable among us, draining real money from the pockets of hardworking Americans, and I'll add, and convincing them to take experimental pharmaceuticals from companies that have been convicted of fraud over and over and over again. So we should like to see some protection from that sort of scammery. And I'm sorry I've gone a little off of my usual format, but that's this. I normally don't talk about proclamations, but this one, and right out of the gate they want to talk about fraudsters and scammers. I'm sorry to get to be a little less than clinical with this, but yeah. Now don't get me wrong, I appreciate any effort to discourage this sort of crime. I'm just saying that it deserves a broader scope. And after all that and the infuriating little proclamation about National Consumer Protection Week, of course hiding behind all that because it's Friday, they hid some more money to Ukraine. And of course the usual language, delegate to the Secretary of State the authority to spend another $400 million in defense articles and services to the Ukraine. Just in case you felt like I left something out.
So I hope one of the patterns we're noticing is that the laws seem to be written where if the president doesn't want to follow them, he just has to proclaim a waiver based on whatever information he's presumed to have. And in the case of supply chains and government controls on their influence in supply chains, and we're talking a country this size, huge industries, it's got to be billions of dollars. It's definitely a breeding ground for conflict of interest. Another major takeaway is that the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Treasury seem to have an awful lot of control over our dealings, particularly financial dealings with other nations. So, again, control of a lot of money. And the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Treasury were not elected. They don't answer to you. You can't vote them out. Now, of course, the person that was voted in appoints them, but you still don't have a whole lot of control. He could put somebody else in there that's better or worse tomorrow. This is Better Than News, and I'm Joe Darginio. Thank you for watching.